In the morning, Margaret's estate lawyer called me. I was standing in my kitchen in Sudbury, making the same pot of coffee I'd made every morning for 31 years. Same mug. Same chair by the window facing the backyard where the birch trees had finally grown taller than the fence. Some habits outlive the people you made them with. Margaret passed in March. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which the doctor said was fast, and I suppose he meant it as a mercy. We had been married 34 years. I didn't know what to do with the quiet she left behind. My son Daniel was there for all of it. Drove up from Toronto every other weekend during those 6 weeks, sat with his mother when I couldn't hold myself together, handled the funeral arrangements when I asked him to. He was 41 years old and had grown into exactly the kind of man you hope your child becomes. Steady, capable, present. I remember thinking, during those dark weeks after Margaret was gone, that at least I still had him. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Drop it in the comments. It matters to me more than you know. Daniel called me in early May, about 6 weeks after the funeral. He said he'd been thinking, and he was worried about me being alone in the house. Sudbury winters are long, he said. The house was too big for one person. He had a guest suite above his garage in the Beaches neighborhood in Toronto. Finished, private, its own entrance off the side yard, and he wanted me to come stay. Not forever, he said. Just for a while. Just until I figured out what I wanted. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 2 days. The house did feel large. I'd walk past Margaret's reading chair and feel the air go out of me. I called my sister Ruth in Winnipeg, and she said, "Go, Frank. Don't be stubborn. Your son is reaching out. That's not nothing." So I went. Daniel's wife, Claire, was polite in the way that people are polite when they've agreed to something they didn't entirely choose. She worked in commercial real estate and had the kind of precise, managed warmth that I imagined served her well in boardrooms. She called me Frank, shook my hand when I arrived, showed me the suite. It had a small kitchenette, a bathroom, a bedroom with a window overlooking the yard. There was a separate entrance, so I wouldn't need to come through the main house if I didn't want to. Claire had thought of everything. I told myself that was kindness. I was wrong about a lot of things that spring. The first month was fine. Daniel and I had coffee on Saturday mornings when Claire took their daughter Lily to swimming lessons. We talked about hockey, about the Leafs doing what the Leafs always do, about whether I'd sell the Sudbury house or keep it. He seemed genuinely glad I was there. I started to think Ruth had been right. I started to feel something close to okay. Then small things began to shift. Nothing dramatic, nothing I could point to and say, "There, that's the moment." But Claire started mentioning more than once that she'd looked into power of attorney, just for my protection, she said, given my age and the estate, and that a lawyer friend of hers could draw up documents quickly. I told her Margaret and I had already updated our wills after her diagnosis, and that I had everything in order. She smiled and said, "Of course, just making sure you're covered, Frank." A week later, Daniel brought it up too. Unprompted. He said it would give him peace of mind, knowing he could act on my behalf if anything happened. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't think about it. I know what a power of attorney means. I spent 22 years as a project manager at a mining company, and I've signed enough documents to understand what I'm handing over when I sign one. I wasn't ready to hand anything over to anyone. After that conversation, the suite felt a little smaller. Then, in late June, something happened that I still don't fully understand how to describe. I had left my reading glasses in Daniel's kitchen the night before. I'd come in for a cup of tea around 9, left them on the counter. Early the next morning, around 6, I came through the side entrance quietly, not wanting to wake anyone. The kitchen was empty. I picked up my glasses, and as I turned to leave, I heard a sound from the basement door. It was nothing, probably. The house settling. But something made me stop. I stood there for a moment, and I heard it again. A soft, repetitive sound, like something mechanical, or like someone moving in a small space. I told myself it was the furnace. I left. But I thought about it all day. 3 days later, I was in my suite when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did. The man on the other end said his name was Paul Renaud. He said he had owned the house before Daniel. Sold it to him 14 months ago. He said he was calling because he was still getting motion alerts on an old security app he'd forgotten to unlink from a camera he'd left mounted in the basement utility room. He said he'd been ignoring the alerts for months, assuming it was Daniel or Claire down there doing laundry or maintenance. But 2 nights ago, he said, he'd actually opened one, and what he saw made him look up Daniel's name in the sale records and start searching until he found me. He said, "I don't know exactly what's going on in that house, but there's a woman down there who is not Claire, and she doesn't look like she's there by choice." I remember sitting down on the edge of my bed. I remember the feeling of the room tilting slightly, the way it had when the oncologist first used the word terminal in relation to Margaret. I asked him to send me the footage. I know what you're thinking right now. I know because I would be thinking the same thing. Call the police. Call 911. Hang up and dial. Here's why I didn't. Not yet. The footage was dark and grainy, shot from a high corner angle the way utility cameras are mounted. I could see a mattress on the floor, a figure curled on it, facing the wall. It could have been Daniel sleeping down there after an argument. It could have been a guest. It could have been nothing. The footage was not nothing, but it also wasn't enough. Not enough for me to make an accusation against my own son that I couldn't take back. Not enough for police to act on immediately without me looking like a grieving old man with a paranoid fixation. I needed 30 more minutes. I needed to see for myself what was in that basement before I handed this to anyone. I called Paul back and asked him one question. Was the camera still transmitting live? He said yes. I asked him to stay on the line. Then I went into the main house. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Daniel was at work downtown. Claire had texted me that morning saying she'd be showing properties until 5. Lily was at day camp. The house was empty. I went to the basement door. I want you to understand something about what I felt standing at the top of those stairs. I am 63 years old. I coached Daniel's hockey team when he was 9. I taught him to drive in the parking lot of Science North on a Sunday morning in February. I was there when Lily was born, and I cried in the hospital hallway, in a way I hadn't cried since I was a young man. Whatever was at the bottom of those stairs, it was going to change everything. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I went down anyway. The utility room was at the back, past the furnace and the water heater. The door had a padlock on it, new, brushed steel, not the kind that comes with a house. I stood there looking at that padlock for a long moment, and then I heard breathing on the other side of the door. I knocked softly. I said, "Is someone in there?" Silence. Then a voice. Quiet, cracked, like someone who hadn't used it much. It said, "Who's there?" I said my name. I said, "I'm Daniel's father. I'm not going to hurt you." Another silence. Then, "Please get me out of here." Her name was Sophie. She was 26 years old. She was Daniel and Claire's former housekeeper, had worked for them for 2 years, had been in this room for 4 months. I'll tell you what she told me, and I'll tell you all of it, because she deserves to have it said. Sophie had come to Canada from the Philippines on a temporary foreign worker permit. She'd been hired by Claire to clean and help with Lily. Meals, school pickups, that kind of arrangement. She was living in the basement. Legally, they had a finished room for her there initially. But 8 months ago, when her work permit came up for renewal, Claire had not filed the paperwork. Sophie had asked repeatedly. Claire kept saying she was handling it, and then one day in February, Claire sat Sophie down and explained the situation. Sophie's permit had lapsed. She was now in the country without status. Claire said she was not going to report her, but in exchange, Sophie needed to keep working. If Sophie tried to leave or contact immigration or tell anyone, Claire would report her herself and have her deported, and she would make sure Sophie was flagged in the system so she could never come back. Sophie had a younger brother in Brampton she was supporting. She had a mother in Manila who depended on her remittances. She had no money of her own. Claire had been holding her pay, she said, for safekeeping. When I arrived in May, Claire had moved Sophie from her room into the utility space and put the padlock on. She told Sophie it was temporary, that things needed to look a certain way while Daniel's father was visiting. 4 months is not temporary. I am not going to tell you I held it together. I did not hold it together. I went back upstairs and sat at Daniel's kitchen table, and I called Paul Renaud back and I said, "I need you to save every piece of footage you have and not delete anything. He said he'd already done it. He said he'd been sitting with his phone in his hand all afternoon waiting for me to call back. Then I called my daughter-in-law's name and I realized I was going to be sick. I didn't call 911 yet. I know that still sounds wrong, but I had Sophie in front of me, alive, scared, malnourished, and trusting me with something that could destroy her if handled wrong. If I called police and they arrived while Daniel or Claire were home, Claire would deny everything, claim Sophie was there voluntarily, claim the room was just storage, claim I'd lost my mind since Margaret died. Sophie had no documentation. I had grainy footage from a stranger's old app. I needed to do this right. I called Ruth in Winnipeg. She is a retired social worker and the clearest-headed person I have ever known. I told her in 4 sentences what I had found, and she told me in 2 what to do. She said, call a legal aid immigration lawyer first, not police. Get Sophie's situation stabilized before anything else. Then call police with a lawyer present who can manage both files at once. I called Legal Aid Ontario. I explained the situation. They connected me with a duty lawyer named Aisha, who said she could be at an address within 2 hours. I texted Daniel and Claire nothing. I helped Sophie up the stairs. She had been in that room for so long that she blinked in the kitchen light like someone emerging from underground. She was thin in a way that scared me. I made her toast and tea because it was the only thing I could think to do. While we waited for Aisha, Sophie told me the rest of it. Claire had approached Daniel about the power of attorney, not because they were worried about my health. They were worried about the Sudbury house. Margaret and I had owned it outright. No mortgage, paid off in 2019. It was worth somewhere around $480,000 at current market, maybe more. Claire had done the math. If they could establish POA over my affairs, they could push for a sale and manage the proceeds. Daniel had gone along with it because Claire had convinced him it was in my best interest. I want to believe that. I don't entirely believe it, but I want to. When Aisha arrived, she was calm and fast. She assessed Sophie's situation, made calls, established a humanitarian and compassionate grounds application process that would protect Sophie from immediate deportation while the case was open. Then she sat with me and we called the Toronto Police Service together. 2 officers came within 40 minutes. I showed them the footage Paul had sent. I showed them the padlock still downstairs on the door. I showed them the mattress, the bucket in the corner, the absence of a window. One of the officers photographed everything in silence. They were still in the house when Daniel's car pulled into the driveway at 6:15. I watched my son walk in the front door and see the police and see Sophie sitting at his kitchen table and see me. And I watched the color leave his face entirely. He looked at me and said, "Dad," and I said, "Don't." That was the last word I said to him that evening. His lawyer told him not to say anything else either. Claire arrived 20 minutes later. She walked in and assessed the room in about 3 seconds, and then she asked to speak to her lawyer. She was calmer than Daniel. She is always calmer than Daniel. I think that tells you something. They were both arrested that night. Daniel was released on conditions pending charges. Claire was held overnight. The charges included unlawful confinement, withholding employment remuneration, and uttering threats. Immigration enforcement opened a parallel investigation into the permit situation the following week. My daughter-in-law's lawyer would spend the next several months arguing it was all a misunderstanding. The footage from Paul's camera argued differently. There are 11 weeks of footage. 11 weeks of Claire going down those stairs with a tray and coming back up without it. I stayed in a hotel in the beaches for 3 nights. Ruth flew in from Winnipeg on the 2nd day. She sat with me at a diner on Queen Street and let me talk until I ran out of things to say, which took a while. I thought about Daniel at 9 years old on the ice, falling and getting back up. I thought about him at the hospital when Lily was born, standing in the hallway with his hands shaking, the best version of himself. I thought about how you can know a person for 41 years and still be holding a stranger's face in your mind, wondering when the replacement happened. I don't have a clean answer for that. I don't think there is one. Sophie is in Brampton now, living with her brother while her immigration case moves forward. She's working at a bakery. She sent me a photo of herself at Christmas, standing outside in the snow with her brother and his kids, wearing a green coat, smiling in a way that made Ruth cry when I showed her. The Sudbury house is still mine. I went back in August and sat in the kitchen for a long time. The birch trees were full with summer. I made coffee in Margaret's mug and I stayed there until the light changed. I've been thinking a lot lately about what loyalty means. Real loyalty, not the version that's actually just convenience. I was loyal to a version of Daniel that I think existed once. I'm not sure when it stopped being accurate. I'm not sure that's something I'll ever fully work out. What I know is this. Sophie knocked on a door in a utility room in February, believing no one on the other side would open it for her. She asked to be let out, and when I heard her voice through that door, I didn't hesitate. Not for 1 second. That's the only part of this I feel certain about. If you're watching from somewhere cold tonight, or somewhere far from home, or somewhere that feels smaller than it should, I want you to know that someone asking for help is not a burden. It's a door. You choose whether to open it. I chose to open it. I'm glad I did. If this story moved you, please subscribe and leave me a comment. I'll be reading everyone. And if you know someone who should hear this, share it. These stories matter because people matter. I'll see you in the next one. There's something I've come to understand slowly, the way you understand most important things, not all at once, but in pieces, over months, while you're doing ordinary things like making coffee or watching snow settle on a backyard you thought you knew. What happened in that house on that Tuesday afternoon was not an accident of fate. It was the result of choices, a long sequence of them, stretching back years before I ever packed a bag and drove down from Sudbury. Claire made choices. Daniel made choices, and I made choices too, including the choice to believe that love, on its own, is enough to keep people honest. It isn't. Love without integrity is just a feeling. It wears out, it bends toward convenience. What holds people to their best selves isn't sentiment. It's the quiet, daily decision to act with honesty even when dishonesty would be easier and no one would know the difference. Sophie knew the difference. She had been stripped of almost everything. Her freedom, her pay, her ability to ask for help. And she had still held on to her own sense of who she was. She didn't become bitter in that room. She became quiet, yes. She became careful. But when a stranger knocked on that door and said his name, she answered. That took courage that I don't think I could fully measure. It takes something specific in a person to extend trust towards someone they have no reason to trust. That quality, the willingness to remain open when the world has given you every reason to close, is not weakness. It is one of the strongest things a human being can do. I think about Daniel too, and I won't pretend that's simple. He is my son. That fact does not dissolve, but there is a difference between loving someone and excusing what they allowed to happen. The hardest moral work I've done in my life has not been deciding between right and wrong in clear situations. It's been sitting with the reality that someone I love chose wrong, and that my love for them doesn't change that, and shouldn't. What I've learned is that integrity isn't what you do when people are watching. It's what you do when no one is. When there's a door with a padlock on it, and no one is asking you to open it, and you open it anyway because you heard a voice on the other side, and you still have the capacity to answer it. I am 63 years old. I have made mistakes I regret, and I will make more before I'm done. But standing at the top of those basement stairs in my son's house, I made the right decision. Not because I was certain, not because I wasn't afraid, but because I had enough left in me to act on what I knew was true, even when the truth was the last thing I wanted to find. That is the only thing I want to pass on from this story. Not the legal details, not the charges, not the outcome, just this. When you hear a voice asking for help, and you have the ability to answer it, that moment asks something of your character, and your character is the only thing that's entirely yours to give.